Well, I think we're ready to start. My name is Edward Schumacer-Matos. I am the director of the Edward R. Murrow Center for Digital World at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. This is our second annual conference on social media and democracy. It's being live streamed on Facebook, as well as what we're doing here on Zoom. There will be, I will interview our panelists for the first, say, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So please, submit your questions in chat via the chat function. And Kate Ween, one of the student organizers, will be gathering all your questions, and then she'll submit them to me, so I'll ask them for you. This first panel, there'll be, 4 more after this one, but this first panel, it couldn't be more timely. It's on the issue of free press and the impact of what we have here with social media and what it's done, reporting in an era of fake news, the media in crisis. And we couldn't have 3 better panelists. We have Ben Smith. He's a media columnist at the New York Times. And before joining the Times, Ben was the founding editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed for 8 years. BuzzFood sounds a little bit more fun. But
BuzzFood is actually a better site.
Courtney Ratch is the advocacy director at the Committee to Protect Journalists, where she's the chief spokesperson on global press freedom issues. Courtney is a former journalist herself and the author of the book, Cyber Activism and Citizen Journalism in Egypt, Digital Dissidence and Political Change. And finally, we have Prashant Rao, who's coming in from London. He oversees the global section at The Atlantic. And prior to joining The Atlantic, Prashant was the deputy business editor for Europe at the New York Times, and he was the Iraq bureau chief at Agence France Presse. So, Ben, let's start with you. What do you see? You're a media columnist. How has the reporting and the writing of stories changed over the last decade as the mainstream media has lost its gatekeeping power, and the public is swamped with misinformation and worse, right, disinformation or fake news?
I mean, it's changed in so many ways that I don't entirely know where to start, but I think I think just the most obvious and biggest picture has been a shift in consumption, toward first the internet and then toward mobile devices and social platforms. And so so these media organizations that were 10 years ago mostly thinking primarily about either a television broadcast or a print news article, found themselves either thinking very hard about what we'll share on Facebook or not thinking about it and having nobody read their stuff, and instead beaten by competitors who were very, very focused on those questions. And I think it's changing again. This stuff is always in flux, and in fact is sort of pulling away from social media right now. But I think, the real story of the last decade has been these news organizations, in some ways chasing what we were doing at BuzzFeed, I think, but everybody scrambling to try to figure out how to get to where their audience had gone, which was social media.
And so, Prashant, you're an Indian who's reported in the Middle East and now in London. Is it any different in other countries? Europe, the Arab world. What do you think?
I think certain principles do apply, but we would be kind of, I think, naive to think that different countries don't bring different issues to the table. As you said, I'm Indian, but I think India is a really interesting example of how this plays out very differently, where, what we would call the kind of quote unquote mainstream press, right? The TV channels and the traditional newspapers are, by and large, not fun to watch. They are not upholding kind of the highest level of journalistic kind of ethics. I think there are some news channels in India that are really fantastic and some newspapers that are really doing cutting edge stuff, but there's a lot of questionable behavior that happens. And I think you're actually seeing a lot of really interesting online outlets that are cutting edge and doing really fantastic journalism, both in all its formats. I think, a really good piece that I would recommend people read was a recent piece in Bloomberg Quint about the kind of really amazing online Indian news outlets that are kind of doing some great work to kind of combat this epidemic. But India, for example, is a very particular story because India has a real issue with, WhatsApp, which, I'm not American, so I don't really, but my general sense interacting with Americans is most Americans don't use WhatsApp to the extent that, for example, I do, or my family does, or Indians do. And so it creates just a very different information ecosystem. And so again, I think the principles are similar, but, the raw realities play out very differently.
Yeah. Well, Courtney, the Committee to Protect Journalists is the world's leading organization to protect journalists, right? And so, but so many of whom are attacked and jailed and even killed in different countries. Are the online attacks that we see, is the atmosphere online spilling over into the real world, and is it leading to still more violence against journalists? And if so, kind of which countries generally would you think that would be happening?
Well, unfortunately, it's hard to say that's happening in only one country. We're actually seeing that the threat posed by online harassment, which is a kind of benign sounding term for actually a wide range of threats and attacks and information sharing that can lead to real danger for journalists. And I think this idea that there's somehow a separation between like the virtual world and the real world just doesn't hold anymore, because journalists live their lives, do their work, and the world, with obviously exceptions related to the digital divide, but much of the world lives their lives on the internet. So we have to get rid of this divide between the two things, because what we know is that online harassment in all of its permutations has a sensorial impact. It overwhelmingly affects journalists as an endemic part of their job, especially if you're a woman journalist, especially if you occupy a minoritized identity in whatever country or context you're working in, and especially if you have any sort of intersectional identities. Some online harassment is endemic to the beat. If you're covering white supremacy, for example, if you're covering corruption or human rights in some countries, you can expect that that's going to be part of your experience as a journalist. And we see that it can have serious repercussions. We have done reporting on how when, for example, President Trump has tweeted at specific reporters or journalists, that leads to a rise in online harassment and threats against them, which can include things like doxing, which refers to the sharing of personal information online, which can then lead to people showing up at their house. Or Patricia Melo Campo, for example, in Brazil, who had to hire bodyguards, even though she had worked in war zones, never had to have bodyguards, had to hire bodyguards after reporting on the electoral campaign there for President Bolsonaro, because she had so many threats that she was worried would translate into physical violence. And of course, there are cases like Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Gary Lankesh in India, Miroslava Breach in Mexico. I'm not going to spend the whole webinar talking about these primarily female journalists who experience severe online harassment, oftentimes some looking like it was coordinated with political leadership in the country, and who were then murdered. We are not saying that they were murdered because of that, but there isn't, the fact is that they experience online harassment, they then experienced extreme offline violence, including death. So, there are a wide range of threats that journalists are facing around the world in democracies and autocratic countries alike. And it's just endemic now to the experience of being a journalist.
Wow. So let me just open this up to the three of you, and let's have a conversation back and forth. What can the media do when it's trying to combat fake news that's so prevalent online? We know that a lot of fact checking doesn't work. So what can it do? Whoever would like to lead off. Ben, you want to start?
I mean, not that much. I do think we in the media are always, and we people of Twitter really believe profoundly that everything is media, and that if there is a problem, it can be solved by a New York Times headline. And in fact, I think part of what you're just seeing is a shift of power away from institutions like ours and toward governments and toward individuals on social media. And so I mean, I think we can try to do our jobs really well, and also I think cover the hell out of probably the most important decision makers, the independent decision makers in the space, which are Google and Facebook. I mean, the real mechanism by which change happens now is one of us writes an article that gets people who work at Facebook mad. They then post on the internal bulletin board that they're mad. And then they upvote that question on their internal bulletin board. And then Mark Zuckerberg has a management problem. And to resolve his management problem makes a change that may have total massive and sweeping impact on billions of people around the world. And so we are sort of reduced to kind of like mall cops for social platforms.
Wow.
Can I give them a little bit more? I'd love to give more credit than just being mall cops. I think that's a great insight. And we've seen that, you know, to your response, I think using journalism to cover fake news, to cover the disinformation problem, to cover the actors in power, whether we're talking about political actors or platforms or, you know, anyone in between, is probably the most important thing they can do. Look at, for example, Maria Ressa, who is the CEO and founder of Rappler, an online news outlet in the Philippines, who actually turned the journalistic lens to the you know, kind of information manipulation that President Duterte was doing back in 2016, you know, all the revelations here in the US. And, you know, if we'd had a little bit more journalism like that back then, we might be in a very different context right now. But I don't think we should be dismissing, you know, fact checking because it doesn't work. I mean, it is part of the solution. It's a form of journalism as well. I think also, you know, one thing that we do at the Committee to Protect Journalists, because we're also a news outlet reporting daily on attacks on the press, is making it very clear, like, how journalism is done. You know, we attempted to talk to this source who was accused of doing X via WhatsApp, via phone, etc., got no reply, adding it in when we get that reply later, making sure that we double source everything. I mean, you know, we get reports all the time. If we can't independently verify and double source it, we can't publish it. So, you know, I think to what Ben said, adhering to the strongest editorial standards and turning the journalistic eye on these issues of power and accountability is critical.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just necessarily repeat what Ben and Courtney said, because I agree with basically everything they said. I think, like, I would just slightly reframe, particularly on the fact-checking question. I am personally fairly skeptical that fact-checking changes people's minds. I think we have to just think deeply about the role it plays in the kind of, you know, the journalistic continuum as we think of it. And, you know, for example, I know, like, lots of sort of fact-checking organizations kind of feed into Facebook's own kind of coding system. And so, you know, if they deem a story to be completely false, then Facebook does kind of de-viralize it to the extent they can. And so, you know, this is, again, not changing people's minds, but not, you know, bringing stories of questionable authenticity to a larger audience. I think if we think that, oh, somebody reads a story on, you know, questionable platform X and then seeks out the fact check to see if they're correct, I'm not sure that's how it works. I think the way fact checks can be used is, you know, by platforms potentially to start to recognize when inauthentic information is spreading very quickly. And I do think, you know, there is definitely the risk, and I think it 100% happens that because we're journalists, we think we are the centers of the universe. Everyone wants to know who we are and what we think, and, you know, obviously that's not true. But that also shouldn't absolve us of things that we can do better. And I think, you know, lots of news organizations are experimenting with kind of interesting things. I don't know if it moves the needle necessarily, but, you know, things like if you go to, like, Sky News's website, on all of their online stories on their desktop version, you see this little thing that says why you can trust Sky News. And they you know, I think this effort to be more transparent is a good thing. It's the kind of thing that forces readers to also then hopefully be a little discerning and start looking for, like, oh, well, this other site that I've gone to, does it have this? And then kind of creating habits that suggest that, like, you know, when you go to the Washington Post website and you look up, you know, their Beijing bureau chief, Anna Fifield, you know, you will see that you'll see her entire background. You'll see where she went to university. You'll see that, you know, they're doing everything that they can to show that this is a real person who's in Beijing, who works really hard and takes enormous risks. And so when they go to a questionable website and that, you know, there is no bio of a writer, maybe we're encouraging them to ask questions implicitly of these news organizations that say like, well, how have you written this story on China if your person is not in Beijing? Again, perhaps this is entirely naive. I don't know, but I think like, I do think there's some value to us being more transparent with our readers so that hopefully we build some habit in them that suggests that when they go to kind of crappier outlets or outlets that should be better, they demand more of them.
I guess I would say, like, yeah, like just on the is Prashant being naive question. Like, I think that, I mean, I'm all for that. And we did a bunch of survey research at BuzzFeed that led us to do very similar stuff. But also, it's a fallback from the position of we are a great brand that you've trusted for 100 years, so just trust us. Like that is a stronger position to be in than, hey, look at this nice person who works very hard. But also is subject to all the kind of smears and lies and personal attacks that, you know, if done in a focused way, can discredit pretty much anybody with 50% of Americans. And so, like, I think that actually that kind of transparency is valuable and is more honest, frankly, than the like hiding behind the big brand that is how newspapers and television networks used to cover up all of their, you know, many failures. But it doesn't get you back to the kind of like, well, I just trust that because I saw it on CBS News of the sort of ancient past.
So were the digital sites like BuzzFeed an answer to some of this, or have we now passed that phase? We've got the BuzzFeeds of the world are in the market, and there's really no place for anybody else to come in with new voices that might actually capture the full public. Or most.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think that like if the question is, are we going back to the dominance of 3 television networks in the 1950s? Like, definitely not, right? I think it's this much more fragmented ecosystem where, you know, different outlets are trying to get their audiences to trust them in different ways, but that there's not some re-centralization happening.
But I think if I may add, because, you know, I think that's definitely true for the United States. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing around the world, and you know, my research in Egypt and the lead up to the so-called Arab Spring and the uprisings in 2011, which was just how important citizen journalism was for presenting alternatives in state-dominated media systems like Egypt, and the important ecosystem that was created through having, you know, global media kind of accredit these individual citizen journalist bloggers who are doing really important journalism that wasn't, you know, really existing in those countries before. I think that's much, much harder now. We are in a very different information landscape where there are a few dominant platforms. So if you can't get your content on those platforms, it won't be seen by the mainstream media, and so it won't get into circulation, it won't get that amplification, which has huge, therefore the content moderation policies of these tech platforms have huge implications for citizen journalists and non-state journalists in countries like Syria, you know, who are trying to report on a situation that, you know, is very difficult for reporters to get into the country, or, you know, for example, in Myanmar and on the situation for Rohingya. So I think we have to think about that, you know, what role that plays. And then also when you think about the expansive surveillance and spyware technology that has advanced over the past couple of years, also making it very hard for kind of individual and citizen journalists to combat kind of the power of governments, couple that with online harassment. We're in a very different media ecosystem now than we were a few years ago. And I think, you know, we're going to see how that plays out as we see how the platforms decide to coordinate content moderation. You know, we've seen this with the Global Forum for to Combat Terrorism Online and calls by TikTok for social media platforms to coordinate on content moderation, regulators calling for them to have pre-upload filters. All of this stuff is going to have potentially profound implications for journalists, especially citizen journalists, but also mainstream journalists.
So is citizen journalism something that's growing, or do you think that's reached its peak? And even including not just in some of the countries you cited, but even here in the United States, people talk about citizen journalism as something to do for local news. Is that a trend of the future?
I think citizen journalism continues to be an important part of the ecosystem, and certainly we've seen that here with the protests. But frankly, a lot of the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests and the anti-mask protests and things like that were coming from journalists who are freelancers. You saw some citizen journalists, but I think, we've always depended on an ecosystem where you have a variety of sources and information purveyors, and journalism is a specific form of, communication that relies on facticity, authenticity, timeliness. Just because you're out there taking a picture doesn't necessarily make you a journalist. It depends what your intent is.
Prashant, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah, I would agree with that and just echo all those points. I mean, I recall back when I was in Iraq, I mean, this was, more than 10 years ago when I first started there. I was, I think the point is to think of it as an ecosystem, and I think various parts of it wax and wane over time. And, how we, the kind of ensuring that there's a diversity of sources within that ecosystem is what's important. And so, like, again, when I was in Iraq, there were lots of just really interesting Facebook accounts that you had to follow, and really interesting, I mean, less so Twitter. And, particularly when the American military had a significant presence there, there were lots of kind of people who, had these really niche military blogs that you really kind of had to read and keep an eye on, just because there would be interesting and unusual details that would spark stories. And, were they citizen journalists? I mean, they were sometimes serving soldiers in the country. I think exactly as Courtney says, we could sort of spend another hour defining what is a journalist and all these kinds of more arcane kind of discussions. But the fact is, I think, there's always been people putting out information in kind of from mainstream outlets, from, big outlets, from new outlets, from on different platforms to some degree or another. I don't know. I think, the extent of it may change slightly, but I'm not sure this is kind of that different. Certainly, Courtney talks about Egypt in 2011. That was kind of a huge moment for this kind of thing, right? I mean, I was impacted at the time, and I was constantly, like, we were just scrolling through Twitter constantly just because we were fascinated by what was happening there.
Ben, for the U.S., do you think there's a role for the citizen journalist in combating
I guess I think that phrase makes, is a little out of date in a way. Like, I don't know, everybody's every citizen is on social media saying whatever they feel like, and sometimes very carefully documenting the truth of their experience, and sometimes making up or sharing insane stories about children in freezers. And I don't know if there's any use in saying, well, this one is just a citizen and this one is a non-citizen but a journalist, and this one has a green card and is sort of a journalist. I don't know. I mean, it's just it's just sort of the stew of social media. And I do think, the sort of mild silver lining that either Prashant or Courtney mentioned earlier is that consumers are getting more sophisticated about, weighting information based on where it comes from and, which TikTok account it's coming from. I had a long conversation the other day with my 11-year-old about how if he sees something really crazy on TikTok, he'll go to the person's page and then, like, check out their other videos and sort of, like, try to understand, is this a credible source? It's like, all right, that's good.
Well, that's good. Do you find that if especially in the mainstream news media, but I think also a lot of the digital upstarts, that if you're identified politically more and more in one direction, do we find that the media is more and more just accepting, okay, I'm going to be center left or I'm going to be center right? Do you find that the American media, in other words, is going in the direction of the European media? I mean, the trend had been for everybody in the world to try to copy more or less the American model, but now I wonder if the trend is not in the other direction. We just accept we're in different camps. I don't know what that's going to mean, but are we moving in that direction, and only within our own camps are we going to solve problems like fake news? But go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's sort of a good way to put it. I mean, I think there are all these different pressures on that. Like, one is obviously President Trump turning the sort of mainstream press into trying to cast us as the opposition pretty effectively with his 40% of supporters, right? Like, he's doing an enormous amount of damage, and it's not like there's some magic wand wave to make that go away. The other is the sort of shift from advertising to subscription, from metro newspapers to big national media outlets, which also encourages you to sort of super serve your power, the people most likely to pay you, rather than speak kind of broadly and uncontroversially to the largest number of people who want to buy mattresses. And I don't think that, the Times leadership hates the idea that that's what they're doing. They think that they are trying to sort of fight against that, but I do think it's just, it's the way the wind is blowing.
Yeah. Prashant, what do you see? Especially if you're in the UK, what do you see in terms of the trends on that in Europe?
I think you're right in that for a long time, the notion of kind of American dispassionate kind of dispatches from the ground, kind of whatever the 30,000 foot, there are the several cliches that we can run through about this. But I do think that has always been, sort of in some way the ideal, in that, the New York Times is the gold standard. Everyone should try to aspire to have all of the various practices and editing and all of that of the New York Times. But it's really hard to replicate that because you have to have the size of the New York Times to do it, and almost no one else does. And then two, I think, a lot of news outlets have found that doesn't really seem to work for them. And also, so much of it is when you look outside of the United States, you kind of have to speak to the tradition of the country. I mean, if you try to impose, American kind of, I say American Times, Journal, Post kind of writing and journalism here, in the UK, it just wouldn't work. And so I say here, I should actually, like, in the interest of full transparency, I'm in Hong Kong at the moment. I'm traveling for work. So
sorry.
Yeah, my apologies. I should have told you earlier. In any case, in the UK, I said here by mistake. The idea of this kind of double sourced, kind of transparent, where the editor knows who the source is, and all of these kinds of the processes of American journalism, and it just wouldn't work. It just wouldn't happen. And so to some extent, we also kind of need to recognize the different journalistic traditions in each country and how we can kind of work with those traditions best, to one, serve the reader, and then really serve the public, right? How do we get information? How do we kind of hold governments to account? How do we hold corporates to account? And then not, to some extent, get kind of in knots about the kind of internal ethical debates that we have when, the real goal is to kind of ferret out malfeasance.
Mm-hmm. Courtney, do you want to add to that?
I mean, I think they covered it. I don't have a lot to add to that. I think it's a very complicated ecosystem, and depending on which country you're working in terms of whether you even have the support of the industry to do independent journalism. One issue I hope we'll kind of touch on also is the role of freelance journalists, because they also don't necessarily benefit from or have the issues that come with working for a big mainstream media outlet that can help provide that credibility. And obviously we're having this seminar in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic, which is also adding a whole new dimension of challenges when it comes to democracy, technology, and the media. So,
yeah. So, one of the purposes behind this conference and the series of conferences is the great concern about what new technologies and social media are having on social cohesion of countries and political cohesion. The great fear that we're on our way to a chaotic situation, very hard to defend democracy. And so, for example, Prashant, you're in Hong Kong. If you go to mainland China and you talk with a lot of Chinese, they'll actually defend censorship precisely because they don't like all that insecurity they feel from the online fighting and the insecurity that's sort of transmitted from online, the kinds of things you referred to in the beginning, which is very surprising when you hear that. Now, I'm not going to say that they all support everything that the Xi Jinping government is doing, not at all, and we'll be addressing that in another conference. But in so many countries around the world, people anywhere, security is the first thing they worry about when things start to fall apart. That's more important than democracy. And so the great fear is, are we moving in a direction that people feel so insecure, especially when we have a government in this country that keeps pushing that things are made, make it look all the worse and try to push this great division, both online and offline, of course. So where I'm going is, with that kind of a concern, what can we ask of governments to do to try to combat fake news and misinformation, disinformation? It can be destructive, and yet we still defend a free press. There's that real tension there. The American model is moreover on the free press side. The European model, the Commonwealth model, has a little bit more controls. And then we all know what's happening so much in the way of third world countries where they don't have the emerging market countries, which it's more difficult to walk that line. They don't have the resources to walk that line of the tradition. And so you find the Russians and the Chinese really trying to push, their authoritarian model. How can we defend a free press and still combat fake news and hold our societies together? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but what do you think? Courtney, you want to start off?
Sure. I mean, one great way to start would be maybe to make sure that politicians aren't spewing the fake news. So it's really challenging for journalists to cover these, newsworthy individuals and not then perpetuate false news or incorrect information. Similarly, we're seeing around the world with coronavirus that we are seeing a proliferation of false news laws, health laws that prohibit the publication of false news, which is then defined as, whatever doesn't comport with the correct version, given by the government, which oftentimes we don't, believe, for example, Iraq, Egypt, et cetera. And, we've seen in the past few years a rise in false news laws generally around the world, especially as, President Trump has really made that a rallying cry that several leaders around the world have been happy to take up and use as a cover for their own repression. So the first thing would be like, let's hold the politicians responsible. We shouldn't be going right to, I think, the content and how to deal with content as the response to disinformation, fake news, et cetera. If you're looking at the platforms, we've seen them roll out efforts, for example, to label state media and publicly financed media so that people understand where their news is coming from. I think you need to do that on a more systematic and transparent way if you're going to improve media and information literacy. But like restricting how you can do ad targeting and the targeting of specific audiences and creation of specific audiences, and of course looking at what the tech platform policies are doing to the sustainability of news media and thinking about what regulation can be put in place to enable news outlets to compete without getting into issues of content. I mean, I think you just want to keep regulation and lawmakers away from the content side and focused on the structures. So, this proposal in Australia, for example, that would require Google and Facebook and these big platforms to share revenue with publishers has had a huge backlash from the platforms. We're seeing a lot of interesting ways that regulators are trying to keep, the media sustainable, and you're going to need, I think, a lot of different approaches, because part of the best way of fighting disinformation is to have a robust, sustainable journalistic community that's doing so.
Ben, you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think as Courtney said, happening in Australia and to a degree in the European Union is really interesting and likely to be kind of imported here, which are in some ways more like the kind of market regulation that you would apply to ports or railroads. Like it's not treating platforms as we have here as a kind of special unicorn that's, whose business is so complicated and magical that, the hands of government can't touch it. And I think that, you're seeing that, I think the question, right, is that like, if you create these powers to essentially regulate speech and distribution, don't they just wind up getting used in some ways by authoritarians to suppress speech they don't like? I think that's the big risk. I think, I think it's just a real risk that people who are pressing for this kind of regulation should be aware of. I mean, and I think, right, you go all the way out on the spectrum to China, which has this incredibly effective government regime for regulating speech. I mean, I think what Trump's doing right now is so, with TikTok in particular, is so interesting because it's really this kind of like totally chaotic, kind of cronyist, like, I don't like this one and I'm going to shut it down version. That's sort of a glimpse of like, well, what if you just didn't operate with any rules at all? And you just shut down the speech you didn't like personally that day. You know, the American courts so far seem resistant to that, but I think it's certainly setting it's setting an example to other leaders around the world of like, oh, right, instead of using these complicated regimes that try to protect speech and you know, put in kind of abstract regulatory frameworks, you can just try to shut down organizations you don't like, which I think is also a pretty big trend.
Prashant, what do you see especially in Europe? You worked for Agence France Presse. The Atlantic has been a big leader on writing about lots of these things. What do you see?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add to what Ben and Courtney have said, to be honest. I think like so much of it is kind of continuing to have the kind of journalistic ideal of holding politicians to account to some degree, because so much of it is, you know, as Courtney said, you know, creating the frameworks that then allow journalists to compete in kind of journalistic fashion. I think, you know, I think a lot of your kind of listeners and stuff will be aware of the case of Maria Ressa, but in a lot of ways, a more concerning one is a similar case in the Philippines against ABS-CBN, right, which is a TV network, which, you know, basically just had its kind of license taken away. And that's, you know, there's a million different ways where you can kind of erode press freedoms and kind of chip away at social cohesion. And there are lots of really boring things that I think governments ideally would do to, you know, improve it and improve press freedoms. And the frustrating thing is, and, you know, this is true of a lot of democratic norms, right, is it just takes one time of it going awry for the whole system to just kind of be put in question. And so, you know, ideally what we want is we want politicians to constantly speak out in favor of free press. We constantly want politicians to not pursue journalists in the courts over, you know, allegations of fake news. We want, you know, regulatory bodies to be staffed by nonpartisan civil servants to the extent that that's possible, I guess. I mean, I just think like it's such a depressing thing, right? I mean, that, you know, if we truly believe that like this was all going downhill, then we probably wouldn't be journalists anymore. So I imagine we all have some measure of hope, but to me, I find it incredibly depressing, the whole system, the entire sort of direction of travel at the moment.
Well, what more can we demand of the platforms that they aren't doing?
Oh, so much more. I mean, you know, one of the things that we're talking about, because obviously, you know, we're at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we're focused on press freedom and the safety of journalists. So a lot of the, you know, press freedom threats that are coming, I think, from the platforms comes because there's a lack of transparency and accountability in their policies, practices, terms of service, in that implementation. And there are backdoors for government influence over the platforms and their decision making, Vietnam being, you know, a great example, one among many. So, you know, a lot of the things that we're involved in, from, you know, the GIF-CT or, you know, the Christchurch call, which is this effort to eradicate terrorism from the internet, you know, it's about highlighting what the potential threats to legitimate and protected speech like journalism are. And so I think that platforms doing more to do human rights impact assessments of their policies, of their terms, of their shifts, also to look at how the tweaks that they do or the signals that they send, you know, how they're going to focus on, you know, video on Facebook, for example, and then you have the industry shift to adapt to that platform because it's been so dominant. You know, we need to be aware of that. And I think, to go to Prashant's point, you know, there are ways to address the market power of these platforms that could have some sort of impact, again, without getting into the content issues. Looking at how advertising, you know, works, the business models. There's some great work by Ranking Digital Rights. And some of these companies are part of the Global Network Initiative, which CPJ also helped found, which is an area where you can talk about the human rights impacts of these types of policies. But I think we've got to get that more front and center, and getting them to adopt those policies, and policymakers also to do policy making when it's not in the middle of an election and focused on, you know, whose information is supposedly, you know, highlighted or not. So I mean, that I think would be a start.
Yeah, I think there's this question of whether the platforms, whether we're asking the platforms to sort of create their own governments. I mean, Facebook is literally trying to create kind of like global court populated by kind of prominent ex-prime ministers, like out of some, you know, maybe this is the, maybe who knows what this becomes. Maybe it replaces the UN and rules us all, right? Like, I mean, it's such a crazy, ambitious effort, but also so bizarre that it's happening in the context of a private company. And I think, you know, it's hard. I mean, the normal way societies deal with this sort of things is that governments and policymakers ultimately create these frameworks, not industries regulating themselves. I mean, though that is more the American pattern, but you know, I think that in both sides, there's this sort of reaching for some kind of functional, kind of technocratic, depoliticized, you know, and transparent regulation of speech on the platforms. You know, the First Amendment in the U.S. makes that very, you know, very tricky, actually. But it's hard. But I think it's hard to see it happening outside the context of some kind of government action, or happening in a functional way. Because otherwise, I mean, Facebook will have shifted some of the hard decisions off to these random, you know, important people. It's on its payroll, but it's a strange system.
We have a question from a listener, Prashant Jain, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, who actually is looking at it from still another perspective. He says, you know, what can we actually expect in the way of self-regulation by the media guilds? And, you know, what can the media itself be doing? He's very concerned about it. It's feeding what he calls a poison and propaganda to so many people, particularly in India. Anybody want to address that question?
I mean, so much of it is, to some degree, I think it's a lot of doubling down on journalistic kind of basics. And I think we sometimes get kind of, we overcomplicate what is a relatively straightforward issue to some degree, which is that, like, you know, if we stick to sort of basic journalistic ethos that we can generally all agree, then there is, you know, at least there's some value to that. And I think, you know, in parts of the Indian press, I think this is like something that really needs to be thought more deeply about. But then I do think there is, you know, to some degree, there needs to be, this is, as with these kinds of complex problems, there's never one thing that fixes it and we can go in 3 months, it's all good. I think you would need kind of a genuine, for one, buy-in from the top leadership at a lot of these news organizations, that there needs to be more invested in training. There needs to be I would say a de-emphasization on kind of speed and a desperation to like be first, which I think is a really kind of dangerous, you know, I was a newswire reporter for 10 years and I know firsthand the sort of the costs and the dangers of trying to be first. It's really hard and you can be wrong a lot of the time. But, you know, there are also, you know, much deeper consequences to that. And I think you also need kind of a general understanding that being a journalist requires some measure of like genuine training in a sort of really concerted way, and not just in writing and story structure, but in like statistics and in understanding, you know, how to sort of wade through vast pools of information in ways that we didn't have to before. And, you know, I think things like that, I'm taking a course in Python because I want to better understand how to do kind of vast kind of data understanding. These are kinds of things that I just think, you know, a lot of news organizations, I think we, you know, the three of us are super privileged, right? We work for actually like really kind of first-rate organizations, which I imagine, you know, invest in some measure of training. But I think we're all aware that there are lots of news organizations that don't have the budget for those kinds of things, and we need to find a way to like empower them and give them those budgets and those abilities to help their reporters and their editors just understand that journalism is not the business it was 5 or 10 years ago. It's not as simple or straightforward, and we need to accept that and help people along the way.
Anybody want to add to that?
And just one small thing to know, which I completely agree with, is, you know, news organizations, for the vast majority of them, are struggling financially, and you have to figure out, where do you put your resources? Do you put your resources towards hiring more reporters? We've seen beat reporting just go out the window in many local communities in the United States. Investigative reporting, very expensive, or do you put that towards safety and security? We've seen that newsroom, safety has become really important in the United States, as it has around the world, as well as the safety of individual reporters. And then you add in coronavirus and how you keep reporters safe when they're out reporting on a health pandemic, and also when they're now all using digital platforms, and they have to think about, how do you ensure good digital safety practices to avoid getting hacked or surveilled, and then you have to figure out, okay, well, or should we budget for SEO optimization, search engine optimization, and how to, get the best engagement on whatever platform, and pivot towards whatever is going to be favored on, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter. So, there's a lot of choices that newsrooms have to make about how they prioritize where they put their scarce resources. So, it's not, I think it's not easy as somebody, who where we're promoting, like, try to, spend more and do more on safety, but also, investigative reporting is so important, because most of what we know about, what's happening with those in power is because journalists have dug into it.
Mac Regan has asked if we could go back to the question of fact checkers, and what can we do about their role and their efficacy, and the pros and cons of fact checkers. Anybody want to address that?
I have a lot of opinions on fact checkers.
Oh, okay.
I kind of dislike the idea that you sort of disaggregate facts from reporting and other forms of journalism, and that there's this other thing called fact checking, which, by the way, is done by the most junior and worst paid people who work on contract for organizations you've never heard of, and sort of provide technical guide. I mean, I think, and then I think, it is certainly, there are facts that fact checkers can check, right? Like, was this speech given last Tuesday? But I think you also then see these organizations which devote themselves to fact checking get really bored with checking facts because it's boring. And quickly their mission creeps to checking, like, is the economy good? Or will this healthcare policy really lead to this, to questions that are really political questions and arguments, not facts. So I actually think sort of and foundations love to give money to fact checking. I mean, to me, there's this whole new kind of industrial complex around it that probably does more harm than good. At its best, I think there's a sort of very narrow version of this that can be a useful service to platforms that can give them signals of, is this outlet, spreading misinformation or not? But still, it's like, the problem with a lot of political misinformation, it's not exactly facts, right? It's not detailed, was this Tuesday or Wednesday type facts. It requires a level of kind of political sophistication and decision-making and context that I think it does not make sense to delegate to the most junior person in your organization.
Well, there's actually some research that shows that fact-checking in some ways propagates fake news, because once you repeat what's wrong, people pick up on that. And if you are from a political point of view that sort of just wants to believe whatever that fake news is, and a fact checker comes in and says, no, that's wrong, you double down in your belief of that fake news, as opposed to question what you believed before. So it's counterproductive. Though if the fact checker comes from your own political persuasion, it might have some influence on you, but otherwise, fact checking may be doing more damage than good. But I think those are good points you raised, Ben. And would anybody else like to add to that? No. So this is a question that's an anonymous question. In your own experience, what do you see as the most serious implications of the rhetoric coming from the Trump administration about press freedom and truth within the media ecosystem?
I'm happy to jump in on that since we've
Okay.
done a lot of reporting on that. So
Yeah.
we just did a report actually in April by Len Downey, the former managing editor of the Washington Post,
Right.
as we had done for the Obama administration. So just to be clear, equal opportunity. But yeah, our reporting found that there has been a huge impact on press freedom, mainly around the world. A lot of the threats to press freedom in the United States have kind of remained threats, although there are the ongoing attacks on confidential sources and whistleblowers that we saw really pick up under the Obama administration and continue apace under the Trump administration, which obviously has a chilling impact and could put reporters at risk for using intelligence sources and those sort of things. And of course, the prosecution of Julian Assange on charges that basically look like journalism is really problematic. The constant threats, the online harassment, which I already mentioned, and this constant denigration of journalism and the news media as fake news, as enemies of the people, has, we don't know what the direct impact between that and the level of police violence against journalists covering the anti-police brutality protests were, but we saw an unprecedented level of violence against journalists during those protests. We, in partnership with the US Press Freedom Tracker, which we helped found, documented more than 900 incidents, or we're working on documenting reports of more than 900 incidents, the majority of which were at the hand of law enforcement. We don't know what the link between, the big, the kind of rhetoric and the action on the ground, but certainly the militarization of the police and the permissive environment created is problematic. But I think really what we're seeing is the biggest impact has been globally. We have seen a big uptick in the number of journalists who are imprisoned on fake news charges. We call it false news. And we've had that category for a long time, but until 2012 and really until 2017, there was relatively few journalists, only a couple every year in prison on that. Now it's dozens. So, we're seeing that as an excuse to clamp down on critical reporting, retaliate against journalists who report uncomfortable information. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges, is there is nobody standing up for press freedom on the global stage anymore, and that has been recognized. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Jamal Khashoggi, because the failure of the Trump administration to react, in a meaningful way to hold the murderers accountable, the ones who have been identified by the intelligence community and by others as responsible in Saudi Arabia, has sent a very chilling message. And as somebody, who worked as a journalist in the Gulf, we hear from journalists around the world what a chilling signal that has sent. And, just to go back to, I think Prashant said earlier, like, it's a very difficult time for journalists, and the failure of US leadership has only reinforced that.
Would anybody like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's just a complicated situation, which more broadly you're seeing like nations reassert their power over the internet, as Vietnam, places like that, as you'd mentioned. But you also see them taking, like when American journalists are complaining of fake news and about sort of what we see as sort of bad behavior on the social platforms and demanding that someone stop it, authoritarian regimes all over the world have said, yes, that's us, we're on it, and passed laws using the kind of rhetoric coming out of American criticism of Facebook and taken it to suppress speech they don't like. And I think it's something that people need to sort of be aware of and careful about.
There's a question from a former student of mine who's an Indian journalist and a wonderful writer, Anu. She's concerned about the loss of local news, not just, we talk about a lot about it here in the United States, but globally, including in her native India. What can we do to try to save local news and have accurate local news instead of, fake news dominating even at a local level? Ben, do you have any thoughts on?
I think there's no silver bullet. I mean, in the United States, which I'm most familiar with, right, the collapse of these metro newspapers, which were a kind of weird artifact of the advertising business, is just
Right.
total. And I think that people need to resist the impulse to rebuild them or to subsidize them or to prop them up, because it's just not working. And I think, you're starting to see other models emerge, subscription and nonprofit, around the US that are pretty promising and doing good work, but it's pretty early days.
Courtney, do you see anything on the local news level as somebody who's really focused on citizen journalism and that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, local journalists are always the ones who are really at the greatest threat on so many dimensions. You know, whether you're talking, they're the ones who are out there reporting on their communities, and that's one of the things that the Committee to Protect Journalists really focuses on, is making sure that local journalists, whether you're reporting on, you know, Native American issues here in the United States, Standing Rock, or whether you're reporting on Boko Haram in a small village in Cameroon, or, you know, in a rural area in India reporting on women's rights, that you know that somebody has your back, because they are at the gravest risk. It's also hardest for their content to be seen in this media ecosystem, given how algorithms work, amplification works, languages, etc. So, you know, they're just in a really challenging position. And of course, we already talked about the economic conditions and all of that. So, you know, I think we need local journalists. We need to support them, because they are the ones who are helping citizens be informed and holding those in power to account.
So Prashant, we had this question from an anonymous question. So taking all this and that we've been hearing and talking about for the last hour, what do you think? Are people more or less informed today in the digital age? And if they're less informed, what can they do to try to separate fake news from real news and try to become more informed?
I mean, I think it's kind of hard to argue that people are less informed than they would have been a generation ago, or, you know, whatever the case may be. I mean, I grew up here in Hong Kong, so I just look back on my sort of, you know, news life growing up. I mean, all I had access to was the South China Morning Post, Time Magazine, and the International Herald Tribune, and that's how we kind of found out about the world. And then I grew up on the BBC, and so we should, you know, I think I would be very kind of surprised by an argument that suggests that people are less informed. Now, we can argue, I think, fairly reasonably, that people are, they get worse quality information to a large degree. Because particularly, you know, I think I'm by no means, I don't know the local news industry as well as Courtney or Ben, but it certainly seems as though it's harder and harder to get local news than it ever has been across the world. But I do think people are better informed. I think, you know, the thing we have to kind of focus on is how do we ensure that something Courtney said earlier, so much of it goes back to the business model of journalism, and making sure that we can kind of get it to work further, so that finding new business models, and there is no, you know, Ben said it, there's no silver bullet. A lot of these things we talk about, you know, complicated issues of press freedoms, a lot of it gets a lot easier if newsrooms are financially sustainable, because that means that they can afford the lawyers who can protect the journalists who are writing the kind of dangerous stories. They can afford the training that helps journalists get better at data analysis. They can afford the, you know, foreign trips that mean that, like, you know, a journalist can be on the State Department's plane, or all of these things, right? And so I think, like, that makes it a lot easier once we can convince people to pay or find nonprofit models, and all of these things make the whole situation a lot easier to address. I mean, this is, I say it's a lot easier. I mean, I'm picking on the most complicated of all the problems, right?
Well, that is a good note to end on. This brings us to the end of our hour. This has been a fascinating discussion. First, I'd like to recommend to our audience and to everyone to join us for our next 4 panels over the next 3 days. They're fascinating. It's a great time, and you know, in the midst of the global COVID-19 pandemic and with the 2020 elections on the horizon, clearly all these questions about internet firms and cybersecurity strategies in the press and so forth, and confronting a new world order, are just at the center of the debate of where we're going as a society and as a world. So I hope you'll join us on that. And I would really like to thank our 3 panelists. This has been a fascinating discussion. I'm going to get a transcript of this and actually read it again, so I can think about many of the wonderful, interesting things you said. And we appreciate so much your joining us. And I only wish we were together so we could all clap and you could hear it, but you have my clap. So thank you, and thanks to the audience.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. See you, Ben. Bye.